What's up, everyone? I'm your host, Eric Hicks. I want to welcome y'all to another Bond Still Quick Take. If you've been enjoying the content and you've been finding it informative, I would ask you, to subscribe and to tap that thumbs up for like and to tap that bell if you want to receive alerts when new episodes or quick takes are uploaded. I'm pretty sure that by now, a lot of y'all have seen the images of what I call the Candace Owens image rehab tour. And I think a lot of people are wondering, how did we get here? We already know, who Candace Owens is and the complicated history that precedes her. But recently, she had the audacity to correctly, I might add, highlight the genocide that the world witnesses occur in Palestine. Now, keep in mind, none of the other things that she said in the past, the derogatory things that she said, I might add, about the black community has been enough to get her axed. However, any questioning of Israel's occupation or genocide within Palestine apparently was a bridge too far for the white supremacists that she's chosen to align herself with throughout these years. You see, to me, Candace Owens, she's learning a valuable lesson about white supremacy. You can't appease an ideology that's erected upon the exploitation of people, the oppression of people, the subjugation of people, and the brutality towards people. You can only smash it. And when you smash it, you have to smash it ruthlessly. Something that America thus far has been unable to do. She made a conscientious and financial decision for years to make herself complicit with this despicable ideology and the pain that it has inflicted here and abroad. So in that regard, I have little sympathy for her in this moment. As a part of her shameless grift, she spent years doing the bidding of white supremacists, which required her not only to critique the stereotypes and disadvantages of black Americans, but to do it in a way where these stereotypes and disadvantages are measured against the alleged purity and superiority of whiteness, which history and the actual lives of black folks has informed us is the principal cause of the stereotypes, the same disadvantages, and the conditions within our communities. So I'm here to say in no uncertain terms, fuck you, Candace Owens. I've lost all patience with this bootstrap shit, okay? We as black folks, understand this, okay? We've done this time and time again. Every single thing that America has asked us to do, we've done it. We've tried to start our own communities, okay? When we started our own communities, what happened? Mobs came, they burned down these communities every time. They looted them, they robbed, they raped, they stole, okay? When that became unpopular, what did they do? Well, if you've heard of eminent domain, they've used things such as eminent domain. They built highways, or they've otherwise taken communities at the behest of state governments, and they've used this eminent domain as the proxy to take property from us that was legally ours. So we've done every single thing that we've been asked to do. Okay, every single thing, and it's never been good enough for whiteness in America. It's never been good enough. So I look at her, and what I see is I see the conservative Negro grifter, in that she tells half-truths, and in the process of revealing this half-truth, she often recklessly omits a material fact from that truth. And that's the problem that I have with Candace Owens. It's not the fact that she says certain things that has been derogatory about our community. I have a problem with that as well. But it's the fact that you take a truth and you attach it to all of these other half-truths, or you just recklessly omit the truth of the matter. And I have a problem with that. Because this is what I see as, it's like a political sleight of hand. In that, of course, she didn't graduate from college, but she's a very astute person, when it comes to manipulation of the media. Okay? So, in this sleight of hand, what you do is that you don't actually tell a lie so much as you intentionally fail to provide all of the facts essential to the story being told. You deliberately omit essential facts. And to me, that has the same effect of telling a lie. Now, in my field, which is the field of law, there's this thing called a Frank's hearing. And let me give you a real quick explanation of what a Frank's hearing is all about. Okay? The Fourth Amendment, it requires law enforcement, if they want to get a warrant, it has to be based on probable cause. Okay? So they have to write an affidavit. In that affidavit, the drafter, which is a law enforcement officer, they have to state the reasons why they are asking a magistrate judge to allow them to search a given residence or a given building. Okay? So what happens is this. They write out the affidavit, they submit it, and the magistrate, he goes over it and he signs off on it. Now, the purpose of a Frank's hearing is this. If the defendant alleges that the drafter of that warrant in that affidavit, that they either recklessly omitted material facts or they just otherwise omitted material facts, then they can ask the court to find that those material omissions violate the Fourth Amendment. Now, there was a case some years ago. This little white guy in North Carolina, Zachary Law, he was alleged to have been selling drugs out of residence. So the police department, what they did was they recruited the assistance of an informant. Now, the informant, he told them that he did have knowledge that Mr. Law was selling drugs out of this residence. Now, the informant had supposedly worked for them before. So, what they did was they did what's called a controlled buy. Okay? They gave the informant money and they verified the residence that Mr. Law was staying in with his mother. And the informant went there. The informant first called and arranged a buy of like 3.5 grams of cocaine. The informant went to the residence. He's alleged to have purchased the cocaine from Mr. Law. He left. Now, when the informant went in, they gave him $240. The police did. He paid $180 for the cocaine and he left. Now, he gave the police back $40 and he pocketed $20. Now, they didn't realize that he had pocketed the other $20 until they got to the precinct. At that time, they asked him where was the other $20. The informant stated he didn't know where it was. They did a strip search, found the money, and they placed him under arrest. Now, the lead officer, he prepared an affidavit for a search warrant of Mr. Law's residence shortly after all of this happened. And in that affidavit, he never included anything about the informant's actions directly after the alleged purchase from Mr. Law. Now, what the appeals court stated was that because this officer left out these material facts about the dishonesty of the informant and the fact that the officer knew of this dishonesty, that the search warrant violated the Fourth Amendment. Okay? So, as you see, when you leave out key facts, there has to be consequences. Under law, there's consequences, and in our lives every day, there has to be consequences. And this is why Candace Owens, her numerous diatribes, some of which involve a grain of truth, to me they lack credibility, because she always recklessly omits the cause of so much of what ails America and the world, which we know to be white supremacy. It's directly responsible for the genocide that we're witnessing in Palestine, as well as the conditions of the people of Haiti. So my beautiful people, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at some, but by no means all of the derogatory shit that Candace Owens has said over the years as it relates to black folks, and what she has conveniently omitted from each of her assertions. And then after we've done all of this, I want you to make your own decision. I'll never tell you what to think. I'll only give you the facts. Now, I won't be shy about telling you what I think, but I want you to have facts, because facts are essential to me to making reasonable decisions as to how we proceed on any given issue. So, first, there's a lie that black people were better off under Trump, even though she did not vote for him. Now, first of all, anyone who knows anything about politics, they know that Trump inherited a good economy. So his main task essentially was not to screw it up. Okay? Black unemployment, it was already on a decline when he took office. So, logically speaking, black unemployment, it was going to continuously decline if he just didn't fuck it up. So, what she conveniently left out in explaining all of these benefits that we received under Trump, and what so many people who support this guy leave out, is that there was something that happened on his watch called COVID. Okay? I'm pretty sure we all know what the hell COVID is. Now, you can't divorce that from his presidency because it happened under his watch. This is the guy who told us to inject ourselves with bleach or let the sunlight hit you. And we all know by now what COVID did and how it devastated our communities. It just pretty much revealed the disparities that we already knew were there. But make no mistake, COVID devastated our communities. And it goes to show you how much misinformation hurt us, because remember when COVID first happened, people were saying that, oh, well, it doesn't affect black people. And that was detrimental to our well-being, because when it hit our community, I witnessed personally multiple people who lost relatives from COVID because of the number of black people in our community that already had pre-existing conditions and the poor health care which exists, within people of our communities. So COVID, it devastated us. But by the time he left office, he's the only president since Herbert Hoover. Yeah, the same Herbert Hoover whose policies ushered in one of the darkest ages of the United States as far as economics is concerned, which was the Great Depression. Yeah, that Herbert Hoover. He's the only president who left office with fewer jobs in the country than when he took office. And that's Trump. We can't divorce ourselves from that fact, Miss Owens. So, and I won't even mention the tax cuts that gave his billionaire friends billions of dollars, while assuring that regular Americans will pay more taxes over time. I won't even go into that. I'll just stick to the essential as it relates to black folks doing better under Trump. We can't divorce what happened with COVID under his watch and how that left us as a community. So I just felt it necessary to expound on that. The next thing was when she posted after the Supreme Court struck down the affirmative action. Now, people who've been following the podcast, you know how I feel about affirmative action. I'm not a huge proponent of affirmative action, but I also believe that in a real functioning democracy, you wouldn't need affirmative action, because in a real functioning democracy, there would be no reliance on a person's color. That society would truly function as a colorblind society, which we know that America is not. But anyways, what she posted was wild. As you see, affirmative action, something that I've spoken out against for the last 7 years, has finally been struck down in a historic Supreme Court ruling. This is a major win in the strive for racial equality, removing the bigotry of low expectations against black students while permitting Asian and white students an equal chance to be rewarded for their hard work. Race should never be a factor whether or not you are qualified for anything. It's a shame it took this long, but finally, justice wins. Make meritocracy great again. Negro, please. Of course, let me explain to y'all something about her, okay? This is the same person who, when she was in high school in Connecticut, she ran to the NAACP to help her, rightfully I might add, sue the school district after a group of white boys racially harassed and threatened to kill her. Now, it's important for me to mention that one of these white boys who actually threatened to kill her, he was the son of the Democratic mayor of Connecticut at the time. Nevertheless, through the NAACP, she was awarded a settlement of $37,500, if I'm not mistaken, from the Stanford Public Schools. Now, she never mentions that. She never mentioned how she benefited from the very thing that she seeks to deconstruct. And it's the same as Clarence Thomas. It's a theme with these Negro conservatives, or so-called conservatives, because I know conservatives who stand on principle, and I don't consider either one of those conservatives as persons that I think stand on principle. For them, it's all about the grift. But nevertheless, she never mentioned anything about what was done for her by the NAACP under the guise of affirmative action. She never mentions that. Now, I want to add on to what I perceive as a flaw in her logic. And it's a flaw that she's no dummy. She knows about this flaw. To be an African American, to be black, period, it has nothing to do with low expectations, okay? And that's not what affirmative action was about. Affirmative action, black students, I'll put it this way. Black students who were allowed admissions through affirmative action, they were not underqualified. That's a lie, and that's a conservative talking point. These students are not underqualified. Oftentimes, these students are overqualified to get into these institutions. Qualified black students, sadly, were being passed over in favor of white students because of a biased administration process. We need not lose sight of that. It's no different than overqualified black people who have been routinely passed over for promotions based on the bias of those people who are in charge of the hiring process. And I'm pretty sure we all know someone, if not us in particular, who have been passed over by someone who's been less qualified. Let's look no further than, let's say, for example, the NFL, the NCAA. The NFL, you look at how many black football players you have, and you look at the number of black head coaches we have. This is why the NFL had to institute the Rooney Rule, which people would argue is affirmative action. It's not affirmative action. It just means that in this so-called democracy, in this so-called fabric of America, people in positions of power have these preconceived biases. And because they're in these positions, they oftentimes hire people who look like them. It has nothing to do with black folks being less qualified. It has everything to do with the bias of people who are in positions to hire. So, and the same thing applies with college football, where you have a very minimal amount of black head coaches, despite the sport itself being populated by black players. You can't tell me that black coaches are not qualified. I've seen time and time again black coaches being passed up for less qualified white coaches, only because the people in positions of power feel more comfortable hiring the people who look like them. That's it, and that's all. And I wish it wasn't like that, but that's just the reality of the world we live in. And this is something that when you talk about affirmative action, you can't exclude this. Because when you exclude it to the detriment of the people that you're explaining it to. And my job is to make sure that we have access to facts. We need access to facts because there's nothing mightier than the truth. At the same time, she speaks on meritocracy. She says nothing about what any of us who've been to college know about the preferences in admissions known as legacy status. And anyone who don't know what a legacy status is it allows less qualified students in based on the connections of their family. She's deliberately silent on this because this favors wealthy whites who often use this status to have their children admitted to the very same elite universities with which they graduated. But she doesn't say a word about this. How is this different from her ideal of affirmative action where less qualified students are allowed in? It's not. But you've chosen to omit this fact, deliberately, I might add. So again, you come up short when it comes to being honest with the people that you claim to identify with. The next thing is the case of the guy in New York, Jordan Neely, who was choked to death by the white guy on the subway. Now, Miss Owens, she put out a tweet. Basically, she stated that she had no sympathy for Jordan Neely. All right, this is just her sentiments. You take a look at the tweet for yourself. But Jordan Neely, he was choked to death by Mr. Daniel Penny. And what we know now is that this guy, he suffered from a mental illness. That is Jordan Neely. The people that were on, and let me also add that Mr. Penny, he's now been charged with involuntary manslaughter. So basically what he did, even though he's entitled to his presumption of innocence, a grand jury believed that there was enough evidence there to indict him. Now, whether or not a petite jury would convict him, that remains to be seen. But at least a grand jury has found that there was enough evidence there for him to be charged with a crime. But Miss Owens, she doesn't mention the criminal. She goes for the person who's dead, and the fact that I have no sympathy for Mr. Neely, a person who we now know was suffering from a mental illness. And let me explain also, because it's important to add this, that morning on the train, he did nothing more than shout. He was sitting there and he was shouting. He was having some kind of outburst. But his outburst, it wasn't directed at any particular person. Yes, maybe some people may have felt threatened. That I don't know. I won't pretend to know. But did that give a person the right to choke the life out of him? That's the question. Did it give that person the right to choke the life out of him? So once again, and like I said, it's a pattern with her. She always goes to the talking point of the white supremacist. She does it every time because, of course, Mr. Penny, he's hailed as a hero/victim on cable Fox News. So it never fails when it comes to something involving us, the positions that she takes. The next thing was, while she was attending a conservative political action conference, which is otherwise known as CPAC, she suggested that the legacy of slavery was no longer an issue in American culture. What she said, to quote her, was, "Stop taking away our self-confidence by telling us that we can't because of racism, because of slavery. I've never been a slave in this country." Now, she said, she made these statements, okay? These are the statements that have come directly from Miss Owens. Now, I would say in this regard, for your information, racism nor slavery, it's never been an excuse for failure in any of the black communities that I've been in, and any of the black households that I've been in. I don't know any black folks who use it as a crutch. But does that mean that we ignore the systemic and the institutional racism that does exist and that has defined so many of our lives, that has been the reason why so many of us have lost our lives at such a young age? No, we don't ignore that. Does she not understand that there's a reason why after 400 plus years, we only own 3% of America's wealth, and that there are policies and an ideology that has conspired to stagnate that figure or to otherwise send it into a severe regression? She never says anything about any of this. But let me take this time to educate her. Okay? She stated before in a tweet that she wasn't black. Basically, she said that she doesn't consider herself technically an African American. She says that she considers herself to be a proud black Caribbean and not a black American, and she stressed how well black Caribbeans have fared in America. But I want to remind her of something that she doesn't state, and that's, despite any of her perceived successes of Caribbean Americans, black Caribbean Americans, I might add, as it relates to black Americans, that hasn't stopped the Caribbean government and the citizens of the Caribbeans from demanding reparations from the European government in the sum of more than $33 trillion through what is known as CARICOM. But she'll never tell you anything about that, because in her eyes, it's more beneficial to her to just parrot and mimic talking points that have been provided to her by the white supremacists that she chooses to surround herself with. Again, Miss Owens, don't tell some, tell all, and allow the people to make their own decisions. Don't manipulate, educate. The next thing in the life of Miss Owens is that she said that based on the hierarchy of what's impacting minority Americans, if I had to make a list of 100 things, white nationalism would not make that list. White supremacy and white nationalism is not a problem that is harming Black America. These are her words. Once again, let me educate. And I'll just go down a list of a litany of things that fall up under the umbrella of white supremacy. Because a lot of times, what we don't do is we don't connect dots. You have to show how these things connect, because there's nothing that happens under the umbrella of this American democracy that's not connected. For every action, there's a reaction. So let me just take this time to just highlight a few, because I'd be forever trying to highlight every little thing. But let me just highlight a few things for her to show how white supremacy works and how the functions of white supremacy, how it impacts the lives of everyday well-meaning Black Americans. I'll start out with things that are just in the recent memory. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, we all know of them. They reached a historic $53 million settlement with the National Fair Housing Alliance and local fair housing organizations throughout the United States to resolve racial discrimination claims concerning Fannie Mac's management and marketing of real estate-owned properties in Black communities. That's one. Navy Federal, right now as we speak, is subject to a class action lawsuit for mortgage lending discrimination. That's something that just happened only a few months ago. Then there's the well-documented discriminatory nature of the tax code, as brilliantly explained by Professor Dorothy Brown in the book, The Whiteness of Wealth. Then there's the Justice Department's settlement with Ameris Bank in Jacksonville, Florida, City National Bank, in LA, and National Trust Company in Rhode Island for engaging in the practice of redlining, which for those who don't know is the illegal practice of refusing to offer credit or insurance in a particular community on a discriminatory basis. Now these are only a few of the banks, because there are more. I just only went to things that have happened within the last few years, but there's a long line, there's a pattern of these things happening. The next is the wage gap. Why does the average Black worker earn 25% less per hour than the average white worker? And why is this figure even worse than it was in the 1970s? I'll next go to the educational funding gap in public schools of predominantly white schools, in that they're afforded nearly $2,000 more than public schools where Black students are the majority. I won't stop there. I'm gonna go to the Fourth Circuit, the Federal Circuit Court and the First Circuit, the Fourth Circuit's finding in the case of the NAACP versus McCrory, that the North Carolina Republican Party, they sought to exclude or dilute the Black vote with surgical precision. They overturned how the GOP in North Carolina drew maps, and how those maps sought to basically disenfranchise Black voters. But I won't stop there. There was another case of Nairn versus Ardoin, which arose in Louisiana, and in that case, which was brought back in March of 2022, there was an assertion that the maps in Louisiana drawn by the Louisiana Republican Party denied Black residents an equal opportunity to participate in the political process and elect candidates of their choice, in violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is what the Fifth Circuit found. Okay, so this is not just something that I'm just throwing out. These cases are documented. You can go and see these cases yourself. Don't take my word for it. The next is the case of Allen versus Milligan, where the Supreme Court held that the Alabama GOP, they likely violated the Voting Rights Act, where they deliberately drew maps in 7 districts which would essentially deprive black voters of nominating and electing the candidates of their choice. So you're basically diluting the black vote, or you're all in all taking it away. And we all know the power of the vote. So these are just a few things. What the Supreme Court told the state in that case that I found interesting is that I want you to go back and I want you to redraw these maps to allow black folks in this state adequate representation. So none of these things are made up. These things are well documented. The fact that you have a minimal amount of black CEOs in Fortune 500 companies, it doesn't mean that black folks are not qualified. It means that they're not getting a fair shot. This is not a meritocracy, because if it was a meritocracy, then these boardrooms would look totally different than how they look. So this is not a meritocracy, Ms. Owens. And the fact that you cherry pick certain arguments, to me, it reflects your deliberate dishonesty. But I'll move on. This is the same Candace Owens who suggested that it was okay for Hitler to make Germany great. Once again, you say things and you say it either in sheer ignorance or deliberate ignorance. I would hope that you said this out of sheer ignorance and not deliberate ignorance. But let me explain who Hitler was, because we already know who he was with respect to the Jews, but a lot of times what people don't tell you about Hitler is what his role was with respect to black Germans. Now, when Adolf Hitler and the Nazis came to power in 1933, there were several thousand black people living in Germany. The Nazi regime, of course, they discriminated against the Nazis. The Nazi regime discriminated against those black Germans because they viewed black folks as racially inferior. Now, during the Nazi era, which was roughly 1933 through 1945, the Nazis used racial laws and policies to restrict the economic and social opportunities of black people in Germany. They also harassed, imprisoned, sterilized, and murdered an unknown number of black people. Now, in the recent movie Origins and in the book Caste, people were stunned to find out that some of those policies, a lot of those policies that the Nazis adopted, they actually got from the United States treatment of the African American during Jim Crow. So everything always comes back to America, but I just wanted to give you that information so that black folks won't move forward thinking that somehow Hitler was okay. He wasn't okay. And Miss Owens, for saying that, she's either, like I said, either being deliberately ignorant, which I hope she's not, or she said it out of sheer ignorance. Either way, there's no excuse. I'll move on. She next stated that for whatever reason, it has become fashionable over the last 5 or 6 years for us to turn criminals into heroes overnight. It is something that I find despicable. George Floyd was not an amazing person. George Floyd is being upheld as an amazing human being. She went on to allege that at the time of his death, he was high on fentanyl, and she also pointed to his criminal history. She stated that, he spent 5 years behind bars for robbery and assault. Did this give the officer the right to take his life? Did it? Really? Like, is this where we are in this day and time, where just because you've been to prison before, that an officer has a right to take your life? I don't think that she would have said it if the circumstances were reversed. In fact, I know she wouldn't have said it, but it just fits a narrative. It fits the pattern of a grifter, of someone who says things because she knows that there's a certain faction of the public that will line her pockets for taking that stance. For me, when I look at what she said about we have this tendency where we make martyrs out of criminals, I would remind her that this is what America has done for centuries. America has made martyrs out of criminals. So if in fact we do engage in this practice, then at least we know where we got it from. And I won't just say it in a vacuum. I'll give you examples. Let's start out with presidents. We know for a fact that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, who was also a rapist, let's not forget that he fathered children with Sally Hemings, and during that time, there was no such thing as consent. So he didn't have to have consent with Miss Hemings because during that time she was considered his property. But Thomas Jefferson, he owned slaves. We also know that James Madison owned slaves, and James Monroe. Those are just the presidents. Let me move on to something that's even more clear. The celebration of Confederates long after the Civil War. Now, if anyone doesn't know, the bloodiest war in the history of this country is the Civil War. You had more than 500,000 people die in the Civil War. And at this point, it's not controversial to say that the Confederates, their whole aim was to overthrow America, or the Union as it was called at that time. But the Union basically represented America. So these people were enemies of America, no less than what America perceives the threat from an Al-Qaeda or whoever else that they have created these images of the threat. But these people fought against America, make no mistake. But we rewarded those people after the Civil War. The very same people who killed Americans, we rewarded them. We named schools after them. There's a Robert E. Lee School, the Jefferson Davis, the Stonewall Jackson, the highways, the Jefferson Davis Highway, the John C. Calhoun Highway, the Thomas Jordan Highway, the Jubilee Early Highway. We erected statues for them. Nathan Bedford. We named military bases after them. Fort Benning, named after General Henry L. Benning. Fort Bragg, named after Confederate General Braxton Bragg. Fort Gordon, named after Confederate General John Brown Gordon. Fort A.P. Hill, named after Confederate General A.P. Hill. Fort Hood, named after Confederate General John Bell Hood. Fort Lee, named after Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Fort Pickett, named after Confederate General George Pickett. Fort Pope, named after Confederate General Leonidas Pope. Fort Rucker, named after Confederate Colonel Edward Rucker. We named naval ships after them. We've given them images on coins and on stamps and on postcards. So we are not the only people who have made martyrs out of alleged criminals. This is something that America has practiced from its inception. But once again, you never mention that. You only focus on the shortcomings of a particular community, and you do it for economic benefit, and it's shameless. But I'll go further. This is the same Candace Owens, who in a post stated that Juneteenth is ghetto and made up. Well, once again, let me educate, because I don't think that it's made up that Lincoln, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in the midst of the Civil War on September 22nd of 1862, where he declared that if the rebels did not end the fighting and rejoin the Union, all enslaved people in the Confederacy would be freed on the first day of the following year. On January 1st of 1863, Lincoln, he issued the final Emancipation Proclamation declaring that all enslaved people in the Confederate States of America in rebellion were free. And that's even if they weren't in Union hands. So what did the white supremacists do at that time? They took their slaves and they fled to Texas. And people, even after the Emancipation Proclamation in Texas, people remained in slavery. And people remained in slavery until it was the morning of June 19th, 1865. Union Major General Gordon Granger, he arrived on the island of Galveston to take command of more than 2,000 federal troops that had recently landed there in the Department of Texas to enforce the emancipation of its enslaved population and oversee Reconstruction. And it nullified all the laws passed within Texas during the war by Confederate lawmakers. And at that time, black folks in Texas were freed. So how is this made up, Miss Owens? How? You tell me how this is made up. These are facts. These are historical facts. These are historical facts that white supremacists held people in bondage years after they had been freed. How is this made up? It fits a part of an ongoing pattern. But I won't stop there. This is the same Candace Owens who said that the young man that was killed in Georgia, Ahmaud Arbery, he was killed by 3 white supremacists. She said basically that he was not simply a jogger, and he was instead burglarizing the home of Larry English on the day that he was killed. Now, at most, even if I take her words as factual under Georgia law, he would have received nothing more than a citation. Because what he did, it wasn't a felony. They didn't even classify it as a misdemeanor. They said that it was a citation because they acknowledged that he came into the premises without permission, but that he never took anything from the residents. But an even more fundamental question, are you saying that, and this is exactly what you're saying. What you're saying is that it was okay for them to take his life. That it was somehow justified. No matter how much you try to Monday morning quarterback and clean it up and say, well, no, I said that they should be condemned for what they did. But why do you focus on his alleged criminal conduct? You do it because it provides cover to a certain swath of people in this country. And it provides fodder for everything that they believe about people who look like us. And you do it deliberately and you do it shamelessly, and it takes away from any of the valid points that you may make. Now, I won't stop there. Let me just say this, because I think that when you have these discussions, it's easy to get worked up. I don't want to be worked up because it takes me out of character. But I just find it infuriating that she's given a pass back into the community. Or that, well, no, I won't even say she's given a pass, because believe me, there are a whole lot of black folks who would do far worse to her than what I would even contemplate. But that goes to show you that black folks are not fools. They're not fools by any means. Now, do you have some black folks who say, oh, well, what she's saying is appealing? There are a few. But my thing is this. For one, she would never be allowed in a circle that I exist. But I believe in scrutinizing things people say. That's like when I say something. Don't just take what I say as true. I would ask you to scrutinize what I say and to do your homework. Don't just take it as gospel because I said it. I wouldn't want you to do that. So I asked myself, how in the hell did we go from the black Republicans of yesteryear, and I mean esteemed people such as Haram Revels, PBS Pinchback, Robert Smalls, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Murray Ann Shadd, Curry, Ida B. Wells, Harriet Fortin Purvis, Henrietta Purvis, to people such as Candace Owens, a Jesse Lee Peterson, a Clarence Thomas, a Lee Elder, and a Tim Scott, just to name a few. How did we go from one to the other? How? These folks, in my opinion, the latter, they shame the memories of the former. They shame the memories of the former. They shame them because what they do is predicated on individualism. It's like an individualistic greed. It's selfishness. These are embodiments of American culture. That individualism, that selfishness. And they've taken that individualism and they've taken that selfishness and they've turned it into a grift. This is what they've turned it into, a real grift. To them, it's about a hustle, a scheme to grift, and a grift that, where they demean people who look like them and provide cover for white supremacists, all in pursuit of a fucking dollar. You notice that this same crowd, they never utter a single word. None of these black Republican grifters like Candace Owens, they never utter a single fucking word when the MAGA crowd cries white victimization and reverse racism. They never say a word. They never. There was a poll just released in 2023 that stated that 75% of white Republicans believe that white people are discriminated against. There's this predominant white victimization of thinking that their election was stolen from them, or that white rural working class Americans have been left behind, or that racial equality and racial equity is a zero-sum game where whites will lose out if the black population get what they are owed from this country. And all of this happens without a peep from the black Republican swindler such as Candace Owens. And I say shame on you. They have what I consider a tacit agreement. It's like the agreement of the coon, such as Owens, to berate one and remain silent on the other. And it's shameless, as I said before. They drag out this same tired-ass false narrative about the black family in the 1950s and how much better off we were then, and they rely on the partially true narrative of the racial wealth gap and how after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it began to widen once again. Now that's only partially true, but they won't tell you that. First of all, like I said, it's demonstrably false. The racial wealth gap actually began to lower in the 1940s, and it actually began to narrow even more at an average of 1.5% a year from the 1960s through the mid-80s. Now, unfortunately, the gap has once again widened with factors such as slower wage growth for blacks as compared to whites and high capital gain on assets owned by whites relative to blacks. And finally, let me run down a few instances of what we faced as a community in the 50s during this time in which Miss Owens and so many other black conservatives like to say that the black community was doing so good. I want you to take a look at these images, and I want you to ask yourself, does this look like a people that were doing good in the 50s? And these pictures tell a story that contradicts what these people say about how good we were living in the 50s and 60s. It's false. It's a part of a talking point. And as I continue to say, when you tell a deliberate lie, it takes away from other instances where you may have told the truth, because you lie deliberately and you lie without shame and you lie for a reason. And that reason is to support the white supremacists with which you surround yourself with. Now, even after that, right? Even after the images of these pictures and what they show, there's a whole nother side of the story as well from the 1950s. And I'm going to talk more specifically about the specific acts of violence and terrorism that we were subjected to in the 50s by white supremacists. There was the bombing in the 1950s, and actually it was in 1957 at the Hattie Cotton Elementary School in Tennessee, where white supremacists, they actually bombed the school because the school said that it would desegregate. They bombed the fucking school. Okay? Then you have images of the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas in 1957, where the governor during that time, the white supremacist governor, Orval Faubus, called in the National Guard to prevent black students from entering Central High School in Arkansas. Now, to his credit, then President Eisenhower, he issued an executive order which federalized the Arkansas National Guard and ordered them to support the integration of the school. But just look at the images. Look at the images of the people. Look at the images of the kids and how they were traumatized by this. If you read the books and you see what the kids went through in those classes, like how they were separated and the emotional, the mental toll that it took on these kids, is shameless. But Miss Owens will never mention that because it's not a part of white supremacist talking points. So once again, fuck you, Candace Owens, and I'm going to continue to say that because you know better. Now, I'm not going to stop there because you had other specific terroristic acts. So I want you to take a look at this list with me. I want you to look at this list and I want you to look at the people. Okay? In 1955, Reverend George Lee, an African-American Baptist minister who had the temerity to found the local NAACP chapter in Humphreys County, Mississippi, urged his congregation to vote. While the cause of his death is disputed, there is substantial evidence that he was murdered for his efforts. In 1955, Lamar Smith was shot dead on the courthouse lawn by a white man in broad daylight while dozens of people watched. The killer was never indicted. Smith had organized blacks to vote in a recent election. In 1955, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy on vacation, reportedly flirted with a white woman in a store. 3 nights later, 2 men took Till from his bed, beat him, shot him, and dumped his body in the Tallahatchie River. One of Till's murderers reflected, "I just decided it was time a few people got put on notice. As long as I live and can do anything about it, niggers are going to stay in their place. Niggers ain't gonna vote where I live." An all-white jury declared the men innocent of the murder. In 1957, Willie Edwards Jr. was assaulted by several Klansmen who threatened to castrate him, took him to a bridge, and forced him to jump, all for allegedly making advances toward a white woman. In 1959, Mac Charles Parker, 23, was accused of raping a white woman. 3 days before his case was set for trial, a masked mob took him from his cell, beat him, shot him, and threw him in the Pearl River. In 1961, Herbert Lee, who worked to register black voters, was killed by a state legislator who claimed self-defense and was never arrested. Lewis Allen, a black man who witnessed the murder, was later killed. In 1962, Corporal Roman Duckworth Jr., a military police officer stationed in Maryland, was on leave to visit his sick wife when he was ordered off a bus by a police officer and shot dead. The police officer may have mistaken Duckworth for a freedom rider who was testing bus desegregation laws. In 1962, Paul Gerhardt, a reporter for a French news service, was killed by gunfire from a white mob during protests over the admission of James Meredith to the University of Mississippi. In 1963, William Lewis Moore, a postman from Baltimore, was shot and killed during a one-man march against segregation. Moore had planned to deliver a letter to the governor of Mississippi urging an end to intolerance. In 1963, Medgar Evers, who directed the NAACP operations in Mississippi, was leading a campaign for integration in Jackson when he was shot and killed by a sniper at his home. In 1963, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robinson, and Cynthia Wesley were getting ready for church services when a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, killing all 4 of the school-aged girls. The church had been a center for civil rights meetings and marches. In 1963, on the same day as the bombing killing 4 girls, Virgil Lamar Ware, who was 13, was riding on the handlebars of his brother's bicycle when white teenagers fatally shot him. The white youth had come from a segregationist rally held in the aftermath of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. In 1964, Lewis Allen, who witnessed the murder of civil rights workers Herbert Lee, endured years of threats, jailings, and harassments in Mississippi. He was making final arrangements to move north on the day he was killed. In 1964, Reverend Bruce Clunder was among the civil rights activists who protested the building of a segregated school. Clunder was crushed to death when a bulldozer backed over him. In 1964, Henry Hezekiah Dee and Charles Eddie Moore were killed by Klansmen who believed the two were part of a plot to arm blacks in the area. Their bodies were found during a massive search for the missing civil rights workers Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, listed immediately below. In 1964, James Earl Cheney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Henry Schwerner, young civil rights workers, were arrested by a deputy and then released into the hands of Klansmen who had plotted their murders. They were shot and their bodies were buried in an earthen dam. In 1964, Lieutenant Colonel Lemuel Penn, a Washington, D.C. educator, was driving to D.C. from Georgia when he was shot and killed by a Klansman in a passing car. In 1965, Jimmy Lee Jackson was beaten and shot by state troopers as he tried to protect his grandfather and mother from a trooper attack on civil rights marches. His death led to the Voting Rights March and the eventual passage of the Voting Rights Act. In 1965, Reverend James Reed, a Unitarian minister from Boston, was one of many white clergymen who joined the Selma marches after state troopers attacked protesters at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Reed was beaten to death by white men while he walked down a Selma street. In 1965, Viola Gregg Luizzo, a housewife and mother from Detroit, drove alone to Alabama to help with a voting rights march in Selma. She was ferrying marchers between Selma and Montgomery when she was shot and killed by a Klansman in a passing car. In 1965, O'Neill Moore was the first black deputy sheriff for the Washington Parish Sheriff's Office in Venado, Louisiana. Moore was killed while on patrol. Mississippi police arrested Klansman Ray McClellan. Louisiana protesters extradited McClellan and indicted him for murder, but released him within weeks for insufficient evidence and dropped all charges. In 1966, Samuel Lamont Young Jr., a student civil rights activist, was fatally shot by a white gas station owner following an argument over segregated restrooms. In 1965, Vernon Ferdinand Dahmer, a wealthy black businessman, ordered to pay poll taxes for those who could not afford the fee required to vote. The night after the radio station broadcasted Dahmer's offer, his home was firebombed. Dahmer died later from severe burns after holding off the Klansmen with his shotgun long enough for his family to escape. In 1966, Ben Chester White, a 67-year-old black man, was murdered by 3 members of the Klan who wanted to lure Reverend Martin Luther King to the Natchez, Mississippi area. An all-white male jury acquitted one of his killers. In 1967, Wallace Jackson, the treasurer of his local NAACP chapter, was one of the many blacks who received threatening Klan notices at his job. After Jackson was promoted to a position previously reserved for whites, a bomb was planted in his car. It exploded minutes after he left work one day, killing him instantly. In 1967, Benjamin Brown, a former civil rights organizer, was at a protest when he was hit by a stray gunshot from police who fired into the crowd. In 1968, Samuel Hammond Jr., Delano Middleton, and Henry Ezekiel Smith were shot and killed by police who fired on student demonstrators at the South Carolina State College campus. And in 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist minister who was a major architect of the civil rights movement, was assassinated as he prepared to lead a demonstration in Memphis. You know, you all, as somber as history can be, there's a certain power derived from knowing the truth. It's a power that is needed when we confront the Eric Adams, the Muriel Bowsers, the Andre Dickens, all of these who happen to be black mayors that provide cover to white liberals in the strain of white supremacy that they practice. And it's certainly the power we need when we confront the dangerous half-truths of the Candace Owenses of the world who provide cover to the naked, and I mean naked, white supremacy practiced within the Republican Party. Most importantly, knowing the truth of history, it allows us to prioritize our battles. What our eyes see and what truth tells us in this moment is that there's a strain of white supremacy that affects both the Democratic and Republican parties. But let me be clear that the white supremacist strain within the Republican parties offers a more instantaneous death to black folks, while that strain of white supremacy within the Democratic Party, it also assures death in a slower form. But make no mistake, a bite of the apple as offered in its present form from either party assures us black folks a mental, spiritual, and emotional and or physical death. But we need to be clear in recognizing that
why in this country in 2020, the financial gap between poor blacks and the rest of the world is at such a distance that people feel like their only hope and only opportunity to get some of the things that we flaunt and flash in front of them all the time is to walk through a broken glass window and get it. That they are so hopeless that getting that necklace, getting that TV, getting that change, getting that bed, getting that phone, whatever it is that they're gonna get, is that in that moment when the riots happen and if they present an opportunity of looting, that's their only opportunity to get it. We need to be questioning that. Why are people that poor? Why are people that broke? Why are people that food insecure, that clothing insecure, that they feel like their only shot that they are shooting their shot by walking through a broken glass window to get what they need. And then people want to talk about, well, there's plenty of people who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and got it on their own. Why can't they do that? Let me explain to you something about economics in America. And I'm so glad that as a child, I got an opportunity to spend time at Push where they taught me this, is that we must never forget that economics was the reason that black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Do you understand that? That's what we came to do. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Now, if I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money, I didn't allow you to have anything on the board, I didn't allow for you to have anything, and then we played another 50 rounds of Monopoly, and everything that you gained and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken from you. That was Tulsa, that was Rosewood. Those are places where we built black economic wealth, where we were self-sufficient, where we owned our stores, where we owned our property, and they burned them to the ground. So that's 450 years. So for 400 rounds of Monopoly, you don't get to play at all. Not only do you not get to play, you have to play on the behalf of the person that you're playing against. You have to play and make money and earn wealth for them, and then you have to turn it over to them. So then for 50 years, you finally get a little bit and you're allowed to play. And every time that they don't like the way that you're playing, or that you're catching up, or that you're doing something to be self-sufficient, they burn your game. They burn your cards. They burn your Monopoly money. And then finally at the release and the onset of that, they allow you to play and they say, okay, now you catch up. Now at this point, the only way you're going to catch up in the game is if the person shares the wealth, correct? But what if every time you share the wealth, then there's psychological warfare against you to say, oh, you're an equal opportunity hire. So if I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you and I had to play and give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and like they did in Rosewood. How can you win? How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. So when they say, why do you burn down the community? Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. Trevor Noah said it so beautifully last night. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. So the social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the do I give a shit about burning the Football Hall of Fame, about burning a Target? You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets and didn't give up. You broke the contract when for 400 years we played your game and built your wealth. You broke the contract when we built our wealth again on our own by our bootstraps in Tulsa, and you dropped bombs on us. When we built it in Rosewood and you came in and you slaughtered us. You broke the contract, so your Target, your Hall of Fame. As far as I'm concerned, they could burn this bitch to the ground. And it still wouldn't be enough. And they are lucky that what black people
time has proven
is equality and not revenge.
Time and time again what happens to us when we're ignorant. And this is why it's so important in this day and time for us to really, really focus on knowing the truth, because we are truly living in dangerous times. Now, we need to be clear in recognizing that the Republican Party, as it presently stands, it represents the head of the snake that we know as white supremacy. And as the age-old adage goes, if we sever the head of the snake, the body will die. That much we know. So that's not in any way an acquittal of the Democratic Party. Instead, it's an actual indictment of the Democratic Party. But I think that we have to focus on the head of the snake. And the head of the snake has proven to me and so many other black folks and white folks as well, to be this current rendition of the Republican Party and the poisonous politics that they proffer. And that doesn't mean that they don't have policies that may be appealing, but you can't separate the policies from the party as a whole. And this is where we run into trouble, because we try to make an argument that the two are divisible, and the two are not divisible. When you take a policy and you choose to support this party because of this policy, then you are swallowing it as a whole. Okay? So, and we need to be clear about that. So, and it doesn't mean that if we sever the head of the snake, known as the Republican Party, that white supremacy will instantly perish. That's not the case. But I do believe that when that happens, we will have dealt it a fatal blow. And this takes me all back to where I began. Candace Owens. You see, with all the openly false and defamatory things that she has said about black people and black culture, while mimicking white supremacy talking points, none of this was as sinister as her comments alluding to the Palestinian genocide at the hands of Israeli forces. This was enough to get her kicked off the Republican plantation. That's ironic. She spent years talking about the Democratic plantation only to be kicked off of the Republican plantation. But I ask you this. What happened to the Republican Party being the party of free speech and the party of being against cancel culture? Because as we can see now, not only did they have an intolerance for her exercising her right to free speech, because even if I don't agree with what she said, she still has a right to free speech, and I won't take that from her. But they are excoriating her for exercising her right to free speech, and there are forces within that party that are actively working to cancel her. To me, the hypocrisy is rich, and it's there for all of us to see if we care to see it. It's always there. If we just pause for a second, black people, just pause. Pause and open your eyes. It's always there. So, to Candace Owens, for never uttering a voice against the people who support the ideology that has not only conspired to make the lives of black folks in America a living hell, for never questioning why black folks have had to work twice as hard and overcome twice as much just to live normal lives, for trying to make us believe that our lives and our culture would be so much better if we mimicked whiteness, and for telling us that our problems lie not in white supremacy, but in our failure to pull ourselves up by our proverbial bootstraps. I leave you with the words of one of my dearest sisters. And on that note, I would just say, black people, wake the fuck up. Wake up. It's time to wake up and realize what's at stake. Now, in closing, because I never want to leave you on a down note, I want to say to all of my listeners and viewers who are interested in truth and who are anti-Tom, until next time, thank you for tuning in, and I leave you with the words of the late comrade George Jackson. Settle your quarrels, come together, understand the reality of our situation, understand that fascism is already here, that people are already dying who could have been saved, that generations more will live poor, butchered half lives if you fail to act. Do what must be done. Discover your humanity and your love in revolution. So once again, I'm going to thank you all for tuning in. And until next time, be safe, stay woke, and by all means, wake the fuck up. This is not a game that's being played, and it's being played out right before our eyes. So I'm going to implore you once again to wake the fuck up. I'll see you next time.